Hi everyone, this is your weekly history lesson. This is Mr. Moller speaking, and today we are going to talk about Charles Robert, otherwise known as Charles I, Hungarian king from the 14th century. Okay, so here you have the presentation. And so it's Charles Robert. And immediately you can see the dates, 1308 till 1342. Now, you may remember that the Arpad dynasty died out in 1301, so that leaves us with a bit of a gap between the official date of the reign of Charles Robert and the end of the Arpad dynasty. I will explain this in a moment. Now, we also call this period foreign dynasties on the Hungarian throne, because with the demise, with the dying out of the Arpad dynasty, we have kings who arrive from abroad, from other countries, and we don't have Hungarian-born kings or kings coming from Hungarian dynasties. The next king, who was actually coming from a Hungarian family, will be King Matthias from the Hunyadi family. For the most of the 14th and 15th century, we have foreign dynasties on the Hungarian throne. Now, you can see a nice map here of the Kingdom of Hungary in this period, and you can see that it is divided into different smaller sections. And also you can see a number of names, people like Máté Csák or Amádi Oba. These are so-called petty kings or petty monarchs because they ruled as if they were the kings of Hungary. But the kingdom was divided between them, and they were basically barons, mighty barons, who had their own military, who collected their own tax, and basically the country was in a state of what we call feudal anarchy. This is a very common phenomenon in most of medieval Europe, when the local landlords become so powerful that the king does not have real power in most of the country. This situation was more or less characteristic at the very end of the Arpad period. The last Arpad kings were not really powerful, and so they gave away a lot of land grants and a lot of power to these local landlords, local rulers, and so they became quite influential and powerful. They were also fighting against one another, so the country was not in a very stable situation. This is the time when the Arpad dynasty dies out, and of course, when there is a question of the inheritance of royal power, it also adds to the anarchic situation. Now, there are a number of people who wish to be rulers of Hungary. Even if you have the smallest family relationship with any of the members of the Arpad dynasty, you can become a pretender or somebody who claims the throne. This period is often referred to as the interregnum, coming from two Latin words, inter meaning between, regnum meaning kingdom or royal power. So in this period, we don't really have stable royal power, so as if we call it between kings or between royal powers. There are three pretenders who claimed the throne during this period. The first one coming from Bohemia or the Czech areas, Wenceslas of the Przemysl dynasty. It's a Czech Polish royal dynasty. He arrived to Hungary after the death of Anjou III, the last Arpad era king, and he ruled Hungary more or less between 1301 and 1305, but he did not really have strong support among the barons, so eventually he gave up his power as king of Hungary. The next pretender, or the next person who claimed the throne, was Otto of Wittelsbach. Eventually, this person was captured by the mighty Baron Laszlo Khan, who ruled most of Transylvania, and the Holy Crown was taken from him. Of course, you remember that by this time, the Holy Crown, or possessing the Holy Crown, is a very important prerequisite of being the King of Hungary. You need three things. You need to have the Holy Crown put on your head by the Archbishop of Esztergom in the capital, that is Székesfehérvár, in this period. If you can have all these three prerequisites, then you can call yourself King of Hungary. Of course, symbolically, that means that the church supports you, and also you have power over the capital of the kingdom. Now, the third person who eventually becomes King of Hungary for the long run is Charles of Anjou. Now, the word, the family name Anjou may sound sort of French for you, and you are right in thinking that. Originally, Anjou is an area in the French kingdom, and that family split up into different sub-branches. The sub-branch that Charles comes from lives around the area of Naples, lived in southern Italy. So he arrived at the age of 13 to Hungary. As early as 1301, he had the support of the Pope, but did not have the support of the local landlords, of the petty monarchs or the barons. So eventually, he was not viewed as a real king for quite some time. But as years passed, and as Wenceslas and Otto was out of the picture, he could get hold of the Holy Crown, get hold of the support of the Archbishop of Esztergom, and eventually he conquered most of the country bit by bit. He was crowned 3 times, and the last coronation was in 1310, and that was a valid coronation eventually. Now, if you have a look at the official coat of arms of the Anjou family, you can recognize that there are some new symbols coming into the royal coat of arms. These are the lilies. Now, I will play a short video about the lilies and give a bit of an explanation about where these come from and what they look like. So, yep. So here you go. So you will see here a few sculptures. These are, of course, from Hero Square, and you have 2 Anjou kings. One of them is Charles Róbert on the left, and the other is his son, Louis I, or Louis the Great, and they both have the lilies as their royal symbol. On top of the crown, you can see them on the top of the crown, and of course these lilies come from French territory, as you can see here in the map, and through the kingdom of Naples, where eventually Charles Róbert, originally called Caroberto, comes from. Now, these probably represent the lilies as the flowers, although some historians say that these might be spears or some other weapon, but most probably these come from the flowers, lilies, and so they were represented in the coat of arms of Hungary. Well, basically, it becomes a mixed coat of arms. On the left side, you can see the stripes, the silver and red stripes that we still have in the coat of arms of Hungary. That represents connection to the Arpad dynasty, and the right side represents the Anjou dynasty with the lilies. And also you can see the very complicated family tree that also shows that Charles had some sort of family relations to the Arpad dynasty. So in a way, the 2 dynasties are mixed. We go back to the map. Here you can see that in the early years, the barons were still very, very powerful. How can you get rid of them? How can you defeat them? Charles had a good tactique, one by one, forging alliances, and basically, like in a chess game, you try to defeat each of them one by one, which he eventually, through the years, managed to do that. Now, so the petty monarchs were in charge of most of Hungary. So this tactique can be called, it's an old strategy, divide et impera, divide them and rule them. So one by one, Charles Robert managed to defeat them in smaller battles, sometimes forging alliance with one against the other, but eventually he managed to defeat most of the petty monarchs. In 1310, he managed to get hold of the Holy Crown, as I mentioned before, and so he had a valid coronation in Székesfehérvár, where the Archbishop of Esztergom put the crown on his head. He still had to fight on for a couple of years. You can see a drawing from the Illuminated Chronicle. 1312 is the Battle of Rozgony. You might see the king on the right side sitting on the horse. You can also see the coat of arms, the mixed coat of arms with the stripes and the lilies on his shield. So he is fighting actively in this battle. He defeated Máté Csák and Amádi Aba in this battle. In the background, you can see the city dweller soldiers coming from Rozgony, from the city itself, and Kassa also, and helping Charles Robert. Now, who supported Charles Robert? After a while, as he managed to become king with full power, he had the support of most of society. The church itself was on his side. The Pope supported him. The lesser nobility, who had enough of the feudal anarchy and the power of the mighty barons fighting one another. So everybody basically wanted stability. Everybody wanted a strong ruler who ends the feudal anarchy, who makes peace inside the country, because that is good for business, that is good for daily life. The peasants also had enough of different landlords coming and going, taxing them several times every year. So they wanted stability and a strong royal power. So eventually, after this battle, Charles Robert managed to strengthen his power. Máté Csák died in 1321, so that marks the end of the era of the petty monarchs. From that time on, Charles Robert was in charge of the country. Now, how did he manage to strengthen his royal power? Of course, you remember that land is the basis of wealth, is the basis of power in the Middle Ages. The more land you possess, the more income you have, the more power you have, as opposed to other landlords or other countries. He confiscated a lot of lands from the petty monarchs, and these remained in the hands of the king. And so these gave the basis of his power. Of course, he needed soldiers, he needed supporters. So he granted some lands to the most loyal people. These lands are called honor land grants, coming from the Latin name word honor, or honorable deeds. These lands were not bequeathable. That means if the landlord died, the land immediately went back to the king, so the king could grant it again. So all the landlords had to behave very nicely and very loyally so that their kids could get the lands again. This way, with this land grant system, the king could secure that the nobles are really loyal to him. So basically what Charles Robert tried to do is to create a new baronial elite, a new nobility. Families like the Garai, Lackfi, Újlaki families became very important in this period. So basically he made a change of elite in the top landlord layer. What he asked in exchange, as usual from the nobility, is military service. They had to maintain their private armies, and if the king asked them to do so, they had to march with the king. They had to go on military campaigns and support the king with their private armies. This system of armies is called the banderial system. Banderia means flag. It's an Italian word. That means that the landlords could march to battle under their own flags, but supporting the king. This meant a bit of independence for the nobility, but also they had to be loyal to the king. But also this made the military relatively unprofessional, as the soldiers and the nobility were not really professional soldiers, they were not mercenaries. So in the long run, this system of military was not really beneficial. Later on, the kings tried to use more mercenaries and more professional soldiers. Now, what do you need? The most to strengthen your power, of course, as in any era, money, money, and money. You may not know this banknote, as this one was put out of use some time ago, but Charles Robert used to be on the 200 forint banknote, commemorating the fact that he was the first king to use forint as a currency. He needed a lot of income to strengthen his power, of course, and he tried to rely more on money as an income as opposed to just having income from his lands in crops, as cash is becoming more and more important for kings. What is a way to get more cash? Is increasing tax or making sure that people pay tax. There were three different ways of collecting tax, the most important ways. The first one is the urbura. I'll explain all of these later on. The gate tax, and also the customs duty, otherwise known as the 30th tax. Altogether, with other monopolies and other smaller income, this is called the regali, or royalty, which means that the king can only collect these type of tax revenues. These are collected on royal prerogative. If I am the king, I can collect these tax revenues. Now, certain economic reforms had to be done. And one of the bases of this was introducing a new stable currency. You can see some pictures of this currency down there. This is called the golden forint and also the silver dinar. King Stephen I also introduced golden money, but that wasn't really used very widely. But this golden forint became the basic currency of Hungary. Why is this important? Why is this different from money minted previously? Is because this was stable. You may remember the phenomenon of the profit of the chamber. A lot of the kings in the Arpad era, what they did to increase their revenues was to devaluate the money. Every year, they exchanged the old coins to new ones, and in the meantime, they extracted some of the precious metal from the coins, and that extra precious metal gave them extra profit. This is what we call the profit of the chamber. What is the consequence of this? The money has less value, less precious metal content, and as a consequence, there will be inflation. People will not accept the same amount of money for the same products, for the same goods, and so the prices will rise. In the short term, this gives some extra revenue to the king, but in the long run, this is not good for the economy. So Charles Robert, together with his advisors, realized that this is not good for the kingdom. So he introduced a stable coins with stable precious metal content, so much so that all around Europe, this money was used by a lot of different countries, and it was trusted because of its stable precious metal content. But on the other side of the story, this profit is missing from the royal chamber. You don't have this extra income from devaluating the money. So Charles Robert decided to introduce a new type of tax, which is a royal tax. This is called the gate tax. This was paid by each and every serf after their serf plots. So if you had your own serf plot, you had to pay this. Why is this called gate tax? It is called gate tax because according to the definition of the tax, if you had a huge gate next to your house, or you have a fence around your serf plot, and if you have a gate that is big enough for a cart to pass through, that means you have a quite big farm. That means you have a big barn and big crops and land. So that means you have to pay this tax. So the size of the gate meant that you had to pay this tax. So again, this was paid by peasants, by the serfs, to the king directly. And it was also defined how much this is, and this was strictly in money and not in crops. Now, the second most important revenue for the king was the customs duty. 1/30th of the trader's goods had to be the value of the trader's goods. 1/30th of the value of whatever they were carrying had to be paid to the king. So that means, for example, if you had, let's say, 30 golden forint worth of goods with you, you had to pay 1 golden forint. When you entered the country, there were certain places where traders had to pay this type of tax. Also, Charles Robert interestingly confiscated a lot of the income of the church. At the time, the papal power was quite weak, so he could do this without getting any sort of negative feedback from the Pope. And so that also increased his revenues. Before we move on to the rent of mine, I would just like to share a short video with you about money, how it looked like in the period and how money minting went. So here you go. Okay, this is a money minter's workshop. So pretty much of it was done by hand. So it was like in a guild where in the workshop that was done. But of course, it was a very important type of work. Only people who were trusted by the king were allowed to do this because the precious metal content was very strictly defined, and so you couldn't get out any of the precious metal. So here you can see some original forints, the lilies you can immediately recognize. The word forint itself comes from Florence, which is a city in Italy, because a very, very similar type of money was in use in Florence. And this guy is also talking about the same thing. And so basically, Charles Robert took the money in Florence as an example, and so he minted coins that looked very, very, very similar. You have the lilies on one side. Of course, it was made from gold, and you can see Saint John the Baptist. I'll just go back for a moment. Saint John the Baptist on the other side, referring to, of course, clerical or religious power. Now, go back to the presentation. And so the third very important source of revenue was the urbura, which can be translated as rent of mine. Mining was quite important throughout the Middle Ages. You might not imagine, but Hungary was a very important source of gold and silver. Even throughout Europe, people would buy a lot of the silver and gold from Hungary. So we were like a superpower in mining. But before the time of Charles Robert, a lot of the mines were not really used, not really exploited for a number of reasons. What happened if somebody found gold or silver ore on his area, on his land that he owned, the king immediately took away the land. The land became royal land and gave, if the landlord was lucky, some sort of land in exchange. Of course, a lot of the landlords didn't really like this because they didn't get any sort of profit from the mining activity, and very often they had to leave their homes behind. They had to move to a different part of the country. So even if they found some of the gold or silver ore, they would either keep it in secret or try to just bury it back and get rid of it and not tell the king. So mining this way didn't really develop that much. So the king realized that this is a problem. We have a lot of precious metal ores and the country is not benefiting from it because people are not interested in finding new mines. So how can we make the nobles interested in mining? One thing we can do is that they get a share from the profit. They get some money in exchange for the mining activity that is going on their lands, and they would also not lose the land. So they would remain in the same place. They could keep the land. It is only the revenue from the mining that most of it goes to the king, but some of it they can keep. Now, this looks a little bit complicated. The urbura, the rent of mine that the miners had to pay to the king was 10% of whatever they were mining. And out of this 10%, 3% went to the landlord and 6.6% went to the king. Okay, so the 10% was shared, 1/3, 2/3 between the nobleman and the king. So this way, also the nobles could keep the land. And so this way they became really, really interested in mining. And so they started to explore and find newer and newer mines. And by the end of the reign of Charles Robert, mining developed and became a really, really important source of revenue. You can see a nice map here. You can see the small signs, the little gold signs and silver signs. These are all the mines, most of them in Transylvania, of course, in the mountainous areas, and in Upper Hungary as well. And so mining became very, very important. New mining cities appeared, anything that ends with bánya, so like Besztercebánya, Rudabánya, these became prosperous, developed mining areas, mining cities, and of course, trading developed. So in terms of business and economy, this is a very prosperous period, the 14th century. Hungary becomes a rich country. Now, what happened to the precious metal? So the miners had to pay 10% to the landlord and to the king. So the king and landlord shared this 10%. But what happened to the remaining 90%? Most of it they had to give to the king, because doing anything with precious metals, gold or silver, that was a royal monopoly. Only the king could process the precious metals. So what happened is that they gave the remaining 90% to the king, and in exchange, they received minted coins. So they basically got money for the raw material, for the raw gold or silver ore. The value was more or less half of the value of the gold they gave. So at the end of the story, the king received half of the value of the mined ore, but also the 6% from the urbura. So he got a little bit more than 50% of all the mined value and precious metal. So this was really, really profitable for the king. And again, you can see the golden forints from the period. It's not just gold and silver, but salt mining. Hungary had huge salt mines. Salt, you may think of it as something very cheap and not so important. In the Middle Ages, it was one of the most expensive products. It was used widely for a lot of things, and it was very, very important and quite expensive. So Hungary could profit from mining salt as well, iron ore, and a number of other things. So mining was really, really important, and one of the most productive mining areas in Europe were in Hungary at the time. Again, you can just see a map showing the different mining regions in Hungary, and the different chambers that dealt with organizing mining in Hungary. Now, some other events that are also quite important in the period of Charles Robert is in 1330, a strange assassination attempt happened. The royal family was having a feast in the Palace of Visegrad. The Palace of Visegrad becomes very important during the time of Charles Robert. He is basically the king who built the castle there, and that becomes sort of a second capital for the kings from that time on. Now, why Felicián Zách attacked the royal family is unclear. He was a really loyal man of the king for a number of years, but according to tradition, according to what we know from this period, the motive might have been something very personal. The brother of the queen might have seduced Felicián Zách's daughter, Clara, and so the father became angry that her daughter was seduced by a member of the royal family, and to take revenge for this, he attacked the royal family. Now, he did not succeed in killing the king. Of course, history could have changed because of this, because that could have ended the life of Charles Robert. He didn't manage to kill the king. He managed to hurt the queen, and he attacked also the kids of the royal couple, but in that moment he was killed by the bodyguards, by the other loyal man of the king. Now you can just see a picture of Felicián Zách being killed in the Palace of Visegrad. Now what happened? Of course, the king got really angry and he massacred the whole family of Felicián Zách, and also his daughter Clara was tortured quite extensively. You can see a 19th century painting about the scene. In the middle, the person with the white beard is Felicián Zách. You can of course also see the king trying to protect his family, and the soldiers on the right side killing Felicián quite quickly. So the daughter, who was in the center of the story, was tortured quite brutally. Different parts of her body were cut down and injured, and also she was dragged around the country, and she had to tell everyone and shout that this is what happens to anyone who tries to kill the king or attack the king. So there was a very, very brutal revenge on the whole Zách family. Of course, we are in the 14th century, so that is something that is quite commonplace. A king would take very brutal revenge for any sort of attack on his person. Now, as for foreign policy, of course, Charles Robert had a lot of income, so he could spend some money on foreign campaigns. So he tried to conquer different neighboring areas, like the area of Nándorfehérvár, not the city itself, was taken in this period. Later on, Sigismund will conquer the city itself, and Nándorfehérvár would become later on a very important part of the southern defense system. Now, in Croatia and Wallachia, he was not so successful. In the same year as the assassination attempt, he was almost killed in Wallachia in 1330. You can see a picture of the attack of the Wallachian people in a very narrow pass. The king and the whole army fell into a trap, and Voivod Basarab almost killed the king again. So this was a very unlucky year for Charles Robert. He could only get away by swapping his armor and swapping his clothes with a heroic soldier who pretended to be the king, and so the enemy was chasing him, and the king could get away in disguise, in false clothes. And so this is how the king managed to get away from this trap. Now, the meeting in Visegrad is a very, very important one. it was a very important negotiation between kings in Central Eastern Europe. This is what CEU stands for. It happened in 1335. Now, Charles Robert recognized that he needs local allies in terms of economic alliance or military alliance. So he invited the most important kings from the region. Joan of Luxembourg, who was the Czech king at the time, Casimir III from the Lokietev dynasty was the Polish king, and of course himself being the Hungarian king. And that sort of becomes a traditional alliance, Czech-Polish-Hungarian alliance. So what we call today the countries of Visegrad originates from this meeting. Even in modern times, there is the so-called V3 or V4 later on, which means a regional alliance, a regional cooperation between Polish, Czech, Slovakian, and Hungarian leaders. So that sort of meeting happens even in modern times. What they were discussing was mostly business, economics. There was one very important problem for these countries. Vienna had what we call the right to stop goods, a staple right, which means that most of the trade routes went through Vienna, the local trade routes. You couldn't really avoid it. And so the traders had to stop and offer their goods for purchase. And the local traders in Vienna could profit a lot from buying these goods and then selling them in other countries. So what they agreed on is that most of the traders would try to avoid Vienna, try to go some other way. So a new route was established for the traders of these countries. Later on, there was a second meeting where Louis agreed with Casimir III on a question of inheritance. If the Polish throne becomes empty, if the king dies without an heir, then the son of Charles Robert, who's Louis, later on Louis I, could inherit the throne. And this was a very important agreement because later on in 1370, this actually happened, and the Hungarian king also became king of Poland. Okay, now dynastic relationships. You can again see the family tree. Charles Robert had two sons, Andrew and Louis. Louis inherited the Hungarian throne, became Louis the Great or Louis I, and later on the Polish throne as well. And Andrew became king of Naples. So the Italian side of inheritance was an unlucky king. I may talk about him later on. Now, how we evaluate this period? He is, of course, the first non-Hungarian king in Hungarian history, well, not counting Peter Orsolyo after Stephen I. So this is the beginning of foreign dynasties on the Hungarian throne. What he left behind after his death was a strong country. Royal power was strong. The nobility was not fighting with one another. So compared to the beginning of his reign, there is relative stability, and that is usually good for the country. The economy was also prosperous. We mentioned mining. We mentioned that taxation was stable, but not too much for the people. And also, just one extra thing, a new crown jewel, the orb that you can see on the right side, was introduced. So there is a new part, a new member of the royal coronation insignia. And even today we have the same orb. Of course, if you go to the parliament, you can see it, and you can see the lilies, the Anjou symbol on the coat of arms representing the Anjou family on the orb itself. Okay, so that is mostly about Charles Robert. I will just play you a few more short video extracts. One is going to be about the Visegrad meeting. Okay, so here you can see a picture of the city of Vienna. So this was the problem that the Visegrad meeting tried to solve, that Vienna had the right to stop different goods. And so you can see the castle of Visegrad, as you can see today. And this was the place where the meeting took place. So with Casimir and Joan of Luxembourg and King Charles Robert in 1335. If you go to the castle today, you would see some wax figures that represent the meeting itself, with the three kings present, Charles Robert sitting in the center, and you would see the queen, and you would see the two other kings sitting at the table of the king. So this is a scene showing how it might have looked like in the period. Okay, so that's Charles Robert in the center. Now, and just one last video I wanted to show you is just to get a little bit of a feeling of the period. Chivalric tournaments became quite popular in the time of Charles Robert. So we don't really know whether these happened before the time of Charles Robert or not, but according to the sources, chivalric tournaments, the games, competitions of knights, became quite popular during the time of Charles Robert. So these were quite entertaining events where the king was normally present, and so the soldiers, the landlords, could show their military skills. Of course, these were not for killing each other, so the swords were blunt, and so the spears did not have a point. So as you can see, they were cut. But the idea was to have some sort of event where they could show their skills as soldiers, and of course, the winner could get some extra land or could get the armor of the opponent. So there were different rewards that they could get. And of course, this was also for entertainment of the crowds, and mostly for the king and for the nobility themselves. And of course, the soldiers looked quite colorful. So this was also a way to show off your fancy clothes, your fancy armor, and all the different coat of arms. So this was a really colorful and entertaining event that became sort of a tradition from this period on. Okay, so this is where we stop the video. Okay, and so let me just go back to you. Okay, good. So this is the end of the video about Charles Robert. So I hope to see you soon with new videos. And don't forget to do the assignment. There will be a quiz connected to Charles Robert about what you can see here. And also, don't forget to, you can download the presentation from Google Classroom. Okay, so for the time being, it is goodbye from me, and so see you next time.